My name is Serhii Plokhy, and I am a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. And that is what professors do. They write histories, and particularly in my case, history of Ukraine. So this is a short answer. The long answer is, of course, much more complex, and frankly, I didn't plan to write this book, and I thought that at some point, maybe later in my career, maybe before retirement, I will put my lectures together and publish a general history of Ukraine. But developments in Ukraine, developments in the region, brought Ukraine and many issues of Ukrainian history to the fore of public debate here in North America. So the headlines were there, and a lot of things that were said, written about Ukraine and Ukrainian past, I just found not simply incorrect, but absolutely on a certain level wrong and misleading. And I thought that I had to put all other projects that I had at that time aside and do this book. So that was my response to events in Ukraine, but also to the discussion that has been happening here in North America. People had trouble finding Ukraine on the map in general. And what you certainly hear is the position that, and commentary on the position that was taken, were made by President Putin, that Ukraine is not a real country, that this is something that was put together from a number of states, and this is gift of Russia, and this is gift of Poland, and so on and so forth. And there was no just reliable information out there. Articles that appeared, there would be all sorts of commentary on them, even if the articles were good. The commentary, some of them may be coming from the stroll factories in Russia, others are coming from really ill-informed readers in US or in Canada. Again, the level of discussion was really very, very low. The Western discourse of the last 2 years is really lack of understanding of the Crimean history. So somehow the Crimean Tatars are not present at all in the Western narrative of the events. And what happened in 1954 is also misunderstood as a gift by leader of the Soviet Union at that time, Khrushchev, that was just maybe his whim, that was not really based on anything. So these things were there. They clearly distorted the picture, the historical image of Ukraine, but even more importantly, they provided foundations for our understanding of what is happening in the region now. There is a combination of two things. First is just lack of any kind of knowledge. That's I would say dominant trend. And another one is, of course, as you said, a Russocentric vision of the history of Eastern Europe. Ukraine appeared on the political map and on the map of the mental map of the world quite recently in 1991. And if you look at the universities, most of the universities, and kind of courses that they are offered, so those would be courses in Russian history, sometimes Russian and East European history, but Russia would be at the center of that. So there is this tradition of, again, looking at the region through the Russian prism, whether people want that or don't want, and filtering news that come from the region through this already narrative that is there, and it just goes from one generation of professors and students to another. But even then, that is a small group of people who actually know something and care. Most of people just would for the first time discover Ukraine right now, and that new interest in the region, I think it has to be met. And it has to be met also by intellectuals, by historians, by literary scholars who can provide a more balanced and more objective vision of the region's past, present, and in that way inform our thinking about the future. The most challenging one was probably chapter on there are actually two chapters on the current events and developments. And when we write about history, we already more or less know there is a narrative. As you said, I'm not the first one to produce a book of that kind. So there is already a narrative. We can play with it, but we basically know what is important and what is less important. When you look at the current events, the impression is that whatever you read today online, this is the most important thing that will probably change the world and will last forever and things like that. And then things develop, and 1 week later you look back and you say, okay, that was interesting and that was exciting, but it looks like this is not something on which the events after that being built. So the question was to look at this 2-3 years that we lived through and figure out what is there really important and really something that is groundbreaking in terms of the future developments, because the idea is that the book will not be read not only today, but maybe a year and 2 and 3 from now, and what I'm writing about and what I'm discussing in terms of events of 2013 and 2014 would be still important and still would explain what would be happening at the time when the reader picked up the book. So that was a challenge. So turning into history really current events and developments. So that's what we are not as historians really trained to do. We are trained to write and to think and to discuss processes that already have kind of completed. So let's say the history of the Soviet Union with the fall of '91, it's already certainly the monopoly of historians, not political scientists. When you look in 2013, 2014, if you look at that Ukrainska Pravda and what they're writing about today, the immediate reaction is, okay, this is extremely important. I want to put this in the book. But will it be important? So that was the main challenge in professional terms, in terms of a historian writing about those events. And that's what makes it different. So really you're on your own out there. You're in uncharted waters, and you just use your common sense. And important thing is not to forget that what you're writing, it's not a commentary that will be read immediately, that you're writing history and that you have to keep this in mind. But then some choices can be right, others can be wrong. Again, with the developments, as I was writing last chapters, of course, things were developing in Donbas, and it took me a while to figure out, for example, that the Minsk Accord, the first Minsk Agreement, that it wasn't just a footnote, that was something on the basis of which a lot would be built in the future. And again, I didn't arrive to that conclusion immediately. When I was writing about that, the accords were there maybe for 1 month, 2 months. They were not halting. The ceasefire was not there. So it was difficult really to say whether this is important or not. And the latest news from the front seemed to be, okay, this is the key. So you write on that, you look, you read, your editors also give their feedback, and so it is a process. There is no one formula, and sometimes you just get things wrong. That's also part of the process and part of the experience. It was a major difference. So on the one hand, I was working on the 16th and 17th century history of Ukraine before I came for the first time to North America. So I knew work that was done by scholars like Frank Sysyn or Zenon Kohut, who at that time worked at Harvard. So some of those articles, we were getting access to them. So they were writing about things that I was writing about quite differently. So that was really interesting, and so there was some preparation in that sense of what Western academia and Ukrainian studies in the West look like. But there were also some shocks and surprises. I can tell you that my first visit to North America was to Columbia University. And my advisor there was Professor Marc Raeff, who was a major figure, was writing on the Russian imperial history, was very important in supporting studies on Ukraine. So one of this very balanced Russian historians of the Russian Empire. And I started to attend his lectures. And there was a challenge, basically understanding what he was saying, not only because of the language barrier and my English was maybe not up to speed, but also he was teaching social history, just a category that was completely unknown to me. I expected to have in lectures names and chronology and figures and events and things like that, and it was a completely different type of history. So at the end, this transition, it was a challenge. It was challenge in terms of the language. Just you have to write, you have to think, you have to research in a different language. But that was not just switching from Ukrainian to English. It was also switching from the, I would say, maybe 19th century language of historiography, how it was conserved in the Soviet Union and highly with very strong ideological component to the Western type of writing. And I would say that process maybe started when I came to Canada in early 90s, but I don't think I'm there yet. I'm still in the process. When I came here, and to a degree this is true even today, but less true than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, what I encountered was that there were two quite distinct groups of Ukrainian historians. So the one group were really part of diaspora, not just in terms of their origins, not just in terms of their social context, but also in terms that institutions were institutions associated with diaspora. So there would be Ukrainian Association of Ukrainian Historians with Wener, and there would be NTSH, so which scholars, very fine scholars, would continue the tradition of history writing that started in Ukraine, either in Eastern Ukraine or in Galicia before World War II, and then went through Germany and DP camps and eventually came to North America. And they were working really in a tradition of the historiography pre-Soviet or maybe developing some very important, like Oleksander Ohloblyn, the important research that started during Soviet times. And those for me was very easy to understand, to work with. We spoke the same language as scholars. Yeah, and then there was another group of scholars, and those were the people who went through the Western PhD programs at Harvard, but not only at Harvard, and they were already, they had certain tradition of this diaspora and Ukrainian historiography, but they were already addressing a little bit different audiences and were speaking differently, and those people were really key for my own transition from writing Ukrainian history, Ukrainian style, to writing Ukrainian history, Western style. Again, there are different trends in historiography in the West. They're not unified in terms of its voice, and different voices when it comes to commentary on those events. What I can say, judging by the reaction to the publication of my book and reviews that appeared since it is out, it was published on December 1st, 2015, the overwhelming majority of reviews is positive, and positive not just in the sense, okay, they like the book or they like the author, but in terms of engaging in the kind of discourse that I suggest. So there is a number of reviews that basically take very traditional Russian kind of a Solzhenitsyn approach. So in this broader scholarly community, in terms of reaction to my book, it's, I would say that certainly the balance is in favor of not Russocentric view and understanding of either Crimea situation in the Crimea, situation in Eastern Europe. But again, it's like with any historiography, like with any discourse, we have different voices and different opinions. In terms of what changed in the last 2 years, well, there is much more, of course, expertise now accumulated by the talking heads on TV about that. So they did their homework. It's not anymore a challenge for them to find where Crimea is or where Ukraine is. So that there is more expertise. And again, it seems to me more consensus in terms that, of course, what happened to the Crimea, it's completely inadmissible in terms of international order, in terms of uses and abuses of history. But again, we have more or less, it seems to me, the same kind of a situation in US and in Canada, but it is different in Germany and it is different in France. So it's this national markets of ideas or territories that are quite autonomous and move differently. So European situation is different. What changed also is that while there is more understanding and more consensus of what happened there is less and less interest in the region. And with the events of Syria, in Syria, of course, Ukraine is not anymore in the headlines, which is good news in terms that, okay, there is no acute conflict and people are not dying. But in terms of ability of Western political leaders and intellectual leaders to focus on certain things, all the time, attention time span, of course, of Western public is very short in all. This particular book was written with an eye on the general public. And the definition of general public is relatively narrow. So let's say people who read Globe and Mail or New York Times, let's say. So people who are interested in history and politics, but not necessarily academics. So that was the from the very beginning. That was the goal. That was the purpose. The challenge comes, of course, how do you do that in the way that it appeals to a broader audience, but at the same time, it is something that is interesting for your colleagues and something that can be maybe used in the classroom for students. So how to write for general public so that you wouldn't be kicked out from your own cohort of scholars and scholars that other scholars would be interested in knowing what you think and how you treat that. So that is the main challenge. Coming from academia and now living for more than 20 years in Western academia, this is the expectation that you will produce something that is academically viable and balanced and not biased. So basically, this is as simple as just living up to the demands and expectations of your profession. And if you are not doing that, if you are not trying, let's say, not to talk about pogroms or about any ethnic cleansing or things like that, well, that means you are biased. So you have to talk about that. You have to explain what is happening. You have to take position vis-a-vis the victims and perpetrators and so on and so forth. And this is part of again, requirements and standards of the profession. And if you do that, you're okay. And of course, there will be disagreements. Of course, there will be critique. Of course, there will be attacks. but you are on a pretty solid ground, and that's professionalism is the key, is the answer. The most they succeeded probably in Donbas. Because Donbas and war in Eastern Europe, it's of course the outcome and result of Russian aggression and the Russian special operation. But you see also people on the ground who are mobilized by the ideas of the so-called Russian Spring, which came with the very different historical interpretation of what Eastern Ukraine is, with this project of new Russia. Again, it was rejected by the majority of the Ukrainian population, but it certainly helped to mobilize support for Russian operations in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. So that's certainly where success was the most obvious, the most prominent. And then in a certain parts and sections of Western political class and intellectual class, as I said, some of reviews of my book, not necessarily that they're critical of the book per se, but they're taking a very clear this Russian imperial narrative, asking the questions that it's annoying that, for example, I am using term Kyiv instead of historical Kyiv, and that I use the language of the peasants. So thinking that you can encounter something like that in English in a respected journal, for me it came as a surprise, but certainly this is indication of the strength of Russian imperial narrative. It's not that the author who writes about that is cheating or is being paid or bribed or something like that. He believes in that. Think about chronicle writing, and you mentioned chronicles at the very beginning of what happened with them. The chronicle writing starts in Kyiv, and then it continues in other centers of Kyiv and Rus, including in the northeast, what later becomes Russia. And you see just one layer over another of chronicles writing about that. And as Kyiv declines and Moscow rises as a major political and cultural center, these things being rewritten or reinterpreted, and that's where the task of the historian comes. That you go there and you look at different layers and you try to understand what was original and how it was transformed, and there is textology and so on and so forth. So this is a challenge. But, and this is result of the ideological and political policies of the later periods. That's again not unique for Ukraine, not unique for Russia. That's a general trend, and this is the challenge that is there. We have another phenomenon, very interesting phenomenon, when major intellectual figures of Ukrainian origins and shaped by the Ukrainian culture move to the north and become major figures in imperial or in Russian politics and culture. And one of them is, for example, Teofan Prokopovych, who really reforms Russian Orthodoxy, someone who was a prefect of the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Another major figure is, of course, Mykola Nikolai Gogol. And again, this is for us, for scholars, this is a very interesting academic problem and challenge, how to write about these people, to what degree they are part of Ukrainian history, to what degree they are part of the broader imperial history or Russian history. That is the challenge that face many scholars of the countries and regions who for centuries were denied their own statehood. Ukraine is not unique. Ukraine is one of dozens of countries that acquired their independence really in the 20th century as the result of the disintegration of empires. The majority of the world consists not of the former empires like Russia, but of former colonies or provinces of empires like Ukraine. So again, we are unique in many ways, but we are also part of the world and general processes that are happening in the world. A lot of materials dealing with Ukraine accumulated in the former imperial capitals, and those would be Vienna, and those would be Istanbul, and those would be St. Petersburg and Moscow. So they're there. And some of them we still don't know that they exist, and this is not necessarily that someone is hiding them, but they're misappropriated, or it's difficult to find them, and so on and so forth. So, but there is no kind of a concerted effort on the part of either of the governments to hide them on purpose. Where we have things like that, it's dealing with the history of the 20th century. And there, in the Russian case, we see a period of opening archives immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And then after that, systematically closing one archive after another on anything that is considered to be maybe damaging to the historical legacy of Russia, on anything that, for example, it would be really difficult, if not impossible, for someone to go today to Moscow and say, okay, I'm working on the history of the great Ukrainian famine, I'm working on the history of Holodomor, would you please give me the documents and the materials? Well, the success of that kind of archival research I wouldn't count on success there. So, and this is just one example. There are topics that are considered by current Russian government to be it's better to close access to the archives, and this tendency is growing. This tendency is growing again, especially in comparison with the 1990s. There is a contest going on for the legacy of Kyiv Rus for a long period of time. So it really started in the 18th century with the debate on the Varangians, whether those were the Vikings who created the Rus state or not. So that was the first debate. By the 19th century, you have debate between Russian and Ukrainian scholars who has the right for Kyiv. And in this debate and discussion, each side appropriates certain symbols and declares them to be their own. And in Ukrainian case, the appropriation of trident. In the Russian case, they, of course, are very excited about Prince Volodymyr. I don't know whether you follow news, but now they decided to build a humongous statue of Saint Volodymyr near Kremlin. And this is their claim for Kyiv Rus and Kievan origins of Russian state, politics, culture, civilization, and so on and so forth. So they choose one symbols and run with them, but not others. And in Ukrainian case, of course, both trident and Volodymyr are important parts of Ukrainian memory and Ukrainian claim and Ukrainian relation to Kyiv Rus. If you think about history, I would say that the corruption in today's Ukraine is part of the imperial legacy. And it is part of the imperial legacy not only in a sense that, let's say, historically Russian Empire was corrupt and corruption was there in the late Soviet period, but also in a sense that Ukrainians really tried to get an independent state a number of times in the 20th century, but they live under their own government now for the last 24 years only. And this is a historically very short period of time. So traditionally, the view was of the state as something not ours, as foreign, as something that imposes certain rules and demands, including taking away your food, like it was happening during the times of Holodomor. So the historical genes of Ukrainians think of the state as something foreign, and where your task is find the way to get around rules and regulations as state. This is not ours, this is not our rules, this is owned by someone else, and for us to survive, we have to think about financial, economic, and other ways to get around the state, because it is not ours. And this is something that the change is not happening overnight. So the roots of the corruption, deep historical roots, are in the fact that the state laws and regulations are not considered to be ours and to be fair. And it's absolutely okay in moral terms to work around them. I think that it wouldn't hurt to policymakers and their advisors to get an understanding in general of what Ukrainian history is, that it's not just was born yesterday like the independent state of Ukraine, that there is a long history and tradition of a particular place and particular group. And that was the goal of writing the book that is relatively short. You mentioned that it's shorter than my books written by my predecessors. But if you would ask me about one chapter, I would say that I want them to focus on the events of the late Soviet period, on the role that Ukraine played in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and through the prism of this relatively recent history to look also at Ukraine goals and ambitions in the region, and also the Russian policy in the region, because a lot of them really comes from the history of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But again, I would like them to look at that specifically, but also keep in mind this much broader context. As you know, my history starts with Herodotus, and I represent him as the first historian of Ukraine, and that's really where Ukrainian history, as a history of a territory, as a history of the culture, as a history of the ethnic groups that settled that territory starts. It starts with Herodotus. I can just share with you just a small anecdote that when we were talking about that book with a publisher, I was saying that, well, I really want a book that someone could get either in Toronto or in New York when they're getting on plane to Boryspil, to Kyiv, and by the time they land in Boryspil, they have already some understanding of what this country is about. And I originally had in mind even shorter book. So later I said, okay, the book is growing. It looks like whoever will be getting this book and getting on the plane would have to buy a round-trip ticket. but still, I'm quite happy that I was able to keep it under 400 pages, because again, it is essential. The smaller the better in this particular case. Thanks a lot. First of all, for interest in the book, and second for really excellent questions and discussion. Дякую вам.
До побачення.